All right, we're going. How you doing, Peter?
Doing great. How are you, Travis?
I'm doing good. So, yeah, thanks for taking the time to be on and talking with me. I appreciate it.
So no problem. It's my pleasure. I enjoy it.
Cool. So, I mean, I found you through Amazon. Your book, "Sitting the Hook," popped up, but then I kind of went on your site and everything like that, and you have like this crazy, interesting story in life that you lived. It's so cool. So, that's just kind of what I mean. I'll kind of let you lead a little bit here because I feel like that's, you have a lot that you've done and have a lot to share and have learned and stuff, right?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I still think of myself as a, I mean, as an average person. I take exception to your characterization of me as anything special.
Well, that's good. You're humble too, I guess.
Well, I try to be.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Cool. So, I mean, I guess let's just start with how did, tell us a little bit about yourself. I guess when somebody kind of asks, what you do or something like that, how do you kind of respond to them?
Well, that's my worst question ever. I hate what you do because I mean I'll start at the end because it's the best lead in for your question. But 14 years ago at 43, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and I was a pilot flying for United Airlines at the time. So now what do I do? Nothing. I'm essentially, that's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I have been unable to fly since then, and I've done a number of things in the meantime, most of which is now right. But I hesitate to tell people I do that for a living because I certainly don't make enough money at it to live off.
Yes, well, that's fair. So, I guess when you're an if you're an airline pilot and then you develop Parkinson's, is that you're not eligible to be an airline pilot anymore?
Pretty much the medication, as soon as you start taking it, it prohibits you. I could have stayed on a little bit longer. Who knows how long if I opted not to take any medication, but that's a give and take. And so I just decided not to.
I see. Okay. So it's more the uh, medications, whatever effects or that prohibit you from flying or driving and stuff like that.
Not driving, but from flying, at least initially in the earlier stages when first diagnosed. Well, first of all, when you're first diagnosed with Parkinson's, you've used up something crazy like 99% of your dopamine levels in your brain. So it's already been progressing for quite a while when it's diagnosed. But
Oh wow.
at that point, generally the symptoms aren't severe enough. Mine was just a tremor in my right hand. That won't stop you from flying, but the medication and some medication has arguably shown a little bit of evidence that it might prolong the onset from getting worse, the severity. So I opted to go ahead and take the medication that was available at the time and do that route. But
Oh, okay.
essentially, yes, sooner or later, you're not going to be flying with Parkinson's, one way or
Right.
another.
I see. Okay. So I guess like how should we what do you think is the best way to kind of attack this? Should we talk with maybe your early life and in growing up and how that all affected you and kind of affected your, life experiences and led to these books and everything?
Sure, yeah, I think that would be impactful. I mean, I uh, I was born in New York, but I grew up in Athens, Greece for 6 years when I was younger. 2 years in elementary school, 2 years in middle, and 2 years in high school. We went back and forth. My father was a teacher, and he could only get sabbatical every once in a while. So we did it that way. And so living overseas had a huge impact on me just because of my curiosity and and exposure to a lot of different things, just a lot of different lifestyles, a lot of different ways of looking at the world, which I think we sometimes are limited in right now. But after
Hmm.
that, I would go back to the United States, back to New York. And at that time, I'd always had a lifelong, at that point, a very short lifelong desire to go to be a scuba diver. It's too expensive and not really available for me in Greece at the time. So as soon as I got back to the States in 1978, I enrolled in a course, and owed my parents money to pay for that, but got it all squared away and ended up working at a dive shop and on a dive boat, and then a second dive shop and a second dive boat for 4 years, which turned out to be, I don't know, if you're not familiar with the diving scene, you probably haven't heard of it unless you've read Shadow Divers, but it's called the Wahoo anyway, and it ended up making its first trips with chartered and scheduled passengers out to the shipwreck, the Andrea Doria, and I participated in 4 of those trips in 1983 and 1984. And that, at the time, it seemed to be, yeah, it was a hard, challenging, dangerous dive, but it didn't seem to be anything special to me. But I was 20 years old and I just didn't know any better.
Wow. So, okay. So so in retrospect, it is a pretty challenging dive.
Yeah, yes, it always has been. I like as I said, I had no idea that this was going to usher in an era of after I left New York in 1985 to join the Navy to fly. There's a number of advances in the dive world. Some of them using trimix for breathing, which stops the onset of nitrogen narcosis, which basically means that you're diving in with a limited mental capacity. You're diving somewhat drunk, which is obviously not a good idea, particularly deep inside a shipwreck, 100 miles out in the ocean.
Yeah.
Only hope of rescue comes from helicopters. So at any rate, there was a number of advances in the late 80s, early 90s after I left, which really increased the number of people going into the Andrea Doria and running charters out there, and the mortality rate just skyrocketed. A lot of people started dying, whereas before, sure, people had always died on it, diving, but it was here and there, usually due to narcosis. And now that the narcosis had been taken away, oddly enough, the reverse had happened. More people felt able to go out to it, and it's not a laughing matter at all. But the irony is sort of interesting. And in my opinion, what happened was a lot of unqualified people ended going out and diving it, and were just in literally over their head.
Right.
But yeah. But at any rate, my first book, Setting the Hook, really initiated by the first set of dives on the Andrea Doria, because I knew there was something special about it, although I didn't consider it related to diving necessarily. I just realized that I was being tested in a way I'd never been tested before, and that I was reacting in a way that I never really expected or knew what to make of it. And that's a common theme throughout my 3 books, in that, well, there's 2 common themes. One, they're all about me, so I'm a one-trick pony. If you can't handle that, then you probably won't like my books. But the other one is that it's about not necessarily physical challenge, although there's a bit of that, but more so the challenge of growth and introspective, and what is really going on that's making me want to go out and do this, and once I'm there, what's helping me, 1, survive, and 2, come back feeling enriched and with a degree of personal growth. And that's actually the not to give away the ending, but that's very much what the book Setting the Hook is about. Is I go back after an 18-year hiatus without having made any serious dives like that, and I take all the advanced courses. Then when I go back, I'm very surprised to learn that what the reasons why I thought I was going back were entirely different from the reasons that I was really trying to return there. And I'm not going to give away the ending, but that was a big eye opener for me, and that sort of set me up for being in a great place. About 7 years later, about 5-7 years later, when I was diagnosed with Parkinson's.
Okay, so you went back to dive again before you were diagnosed with Parkinson's.
Yeah, it was about the time probably that I was first experiencing symptoms, but I hadn't been diagnosed yet.
Oh, okay, I see.
but in retrospect, I could tell,
Yeah.
But that, yeah, and then that's in a nutshell what the first book is about, and it's really about growing up and understanding the past in a way that is not just realistic, but it's helpful
Mm-hmm.
and and helpful in personal growth and understanding a little bit, perhaps, about what's the point or how to get through life as it were.
Okay. Interesting. So that's kind of the main takeaways of the books and what you've learned from that. So, okay, can you tell me? I'm curious about. I mean, the Andrea Doria or Andrea Doria. Am I correct pronouncing that correctly?
And it's really Andrea. It's a guy's name, Andrea
Oh,
Doria, but
Andrea.
everybody pronounces it Andrea Doria, at least in the country. So it would sound weird to pronounce it correctly.
Oh,
So
okay.
feel free to pronounce it correctly, and I won't call you on it.
Okay, okay. So we'll just go with Andrea Doria. We'll be wrong, but we'll be with everybody else here in the U.S.
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, I'm familiar with, I've heard of it obviously, and I'm familiar with the overall story. But can you kind of give me, and the people listening, like a little bit of a history on that?
Sure. The Andrea Doria was a premier liner when it sank in 1956. It was the end of the end of the luxury liner glory years, and when they're starting to be retired in a year or two later, really the jet age took over, and people just did not use them anymore as a common transportation. It was on its way out of New York back to Genoa, Italy, its home port, when and at off of the Nantucket Lightship, about 50 miles south of Nantucket, 100 miles from Montauk. You can visualize and triangulate Montauk, Long Island, New York. There was a point where, in a deep fog, due to a confluence of errors on both ship's cruise parts, the Stockholm, which is another liner from Sweden, and the Andrea Doria collided. Now the Andrea Doria took the worst of it, and the Stockholm, with its icebreaker bow, ended up piercing its starboard side, uh, and and about 10 hours later, it sunk. It sank. Now the fact that it took 10 hours in retrospect lends a certain element of calm to the understanding of the situation, but it almost immediately healed over to 20 degrees angle of list.
Oh,
And that's an extreme angle. So it seemed that it was going to go slip under at any moment for the 10 hours it took to sink.
mm-hmm.
But one of the most remarkable things about the accident itself is the rescue, in that there was 51 people who were killed in the initial collision, and a few of those people, due to injuries incurred on the initial collision. But there was nobody else killed after that, in that everybody was rescued successfully due to the efforts of a number of ships. I believe five different ships that came racing to
Oh,
the SOS signal. And then since then, the day after she sank, Peter Gimble dove the wreck. He chartered a fishing boat out of Nantucket and followed the bubbles down with Joe Fox, a friend of his. And they went down and just with double hosed air regulators and snap pictures that ended up on Life magazine's cover. So
wow.
it's from the day it sank to the day after it sank, there was a transition from the importance of her as an above the water icon of shipping, luxury liner shipping, to below the water and what would eventually be termed somewhat unofficially as the Mount Everest of shipwrecks. Uh,
Oh,
now,
okay.
now, since then, a large reason why it was determined that was because of the ability to penetrate the wreck. It was nearly intact completely in the first several decades. And so the distance you could travel inside to hunt for artifacts and just look around was only limited by your skill and brains.
Wow.
lack of brains, I should say, um, which earlier on, with the narcosis involved with that, affected everybody to a certain degree. Um, as the years went on, it collapsed, and now these days, from what I understand, it's been pretty much almost flattened, and there's really nowhere that you can go in the inside like people used to in the glory days, the 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
But but it's still a big attraction. I just wouldn't necessarily call it the Mount Everest of shipwrecks anymore. I don't think that would necessarily be a fitting title.
Right. Yeah, wow. I can imagine that must just be insanely cool and almost eerie to have a boat that intact, sunken at the bottom of the ocean like that, where you can even swim inside of it. Did you ever get to how, like, when you went down to explore, did you ever go into it like that?
Uh, yes, starting with the very first time on it, and I ended up making 13 dives on it in those 2 years, 83 and 84. And it would have been less reckless to dive the outside first and acclimate yourself, but you never know out there. 100 miles from shore, you're hooked up to the shipwreck in the middle of the shipping lanes, and current and fog and current are common there. It really you took every chance to dive it very seriously, and you wanted to maximize whatever you got from the dive as much as you could. So
Hmm.
yeah, the first dive for pretty much all 13, my buddies and I went inside, and we would drop in through a hole that had been cut by a follow-on Peter Gimbel expedition in 1981 to retrieve the purser safe. They were unsuccessful, but they did find the Bank of Rome safe. And then if anybody who's alive in the 80s will remember they had it on TV as they opened it and got nothing but soggy bills out, that sort of thing. But it was quite an amazing feat to get it. And in the process, they cut open the foyer deck doors so that people now had access to deep inside the wreck through those doors.
Wow.
And so where we would typically go in would be we drop in from the hole, which was then it was about 170 feet deep, go down just referencing our depth gauges because that was the only thing you could see in the murk and the disarray of all the obstacles that had gone, helter skelter thrown about as the ship sank. Plus
Right.
the fact there's a couple feet of silt in there made visibility very problematic. You drop down 25 feet, go aft, um, another 70 feet, turn around, get a reference to a bulkhead, and then drop our feet in the silt and start digging for china and anything we could get. Throw it in our mesh bags. Sometimes we'd miss, but we usually get it in the mesh bag. And then when our time was up, you could just see your gauges by holding them up really close to your face. We re-engage that reference point and feel our way out. So the entire thing from the moment we reached the end of the passage to the time we were out of there was done with zero visibility just by feel. And that was by design because we knew that second we touched the silt, we weren't going to see anything anyways anymore.
Hmm.
So we might as well plan for it. And it seemed
Wow.
to work out pretty well, except that sometimes people got a little ahead of themselves. In other words, me, and I went beyond where we normally had gone. This is, I think, on our second trip in 1983, second expedition. And I knew that the first class dining room was just beyond where we had been digging. And I left my buddy there without telling him. I figured I was just going to stick my head out and look at it. As it turns out, I ended up swimming out into the middle of the first class dining room. By the time I turned around to come back, my buddy, his digging had been carried into the first class dining room by a slight current, and I was met with zero visibility, smack in the face, free floating in the first class dining room. At that point, there was only one way in and one way out, and I didn't know whether it was up or down or straight ahead. And that was the first in my life experience where I felt at the same time wildly out of control, frightened as frightened can be, but also oddly calm. and with an overabiding sense that I'm going to get out of this. I just got to keep working at it, but
Uh-huh.
it's going to be okay. And since, well, I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but that's that's the feeling and the overall sense of well-being in the face of adversity, serious adversity, that I've tried to recreate and determine what's the source of that. And that's what my writing is really about. That's a commonality between my three books. At any rate, though, I did after going too high and going too low, eventually find my way out. But it was an experience that I'll never forget for a variety of reasons, but fear being the biggest one.
Yeah. Whew, man. So I guess you just kind of have a feeling of, do you feel like panic when this is happening, or do you just kind of feel like
Well,
motivation, or I don't know.
I felt panic.
Yeah.
There's no question. No question. It was a fight against panic, followed very shortly thereafter by an odd calming effect, which I attributed at the time to the nitrogen narcosis. I figured that can either make you more panicky, or I suppose it could calm you down. It's like laughing gas to the dentist.
Uh-huh.
It's the same sort of thing. Now, which one it was, I'm not really sure, but uh, yes, it's. I think the words I use in the book are, I was between a paralyzing panic and um, and a decisive reasoning, but there's a razor thin line there where you don't lose control and you keep your head about you, but you know that things just got real serious.
Hmm.
And if you make one mistake, you might get away with it, but you very good chance you're not going to.
Right. So is this something that is sort of natural to, I mean, is it just something that you were kind of born with, or do you think it's something that you've sort of developed?
To the contrary, I would say I was absolutely not born with it. I mean,
Oh,
I
okay.
think that, I look back and I see what some of these people have done since I left there in 1985, New York, and I see that what the penetrations and that sort of thing they're doing, they seem very suited for it, and they seem naturals at it. For me, it was a fight every kick of the way. But and that's partially why. I mean, I don't feel it wasn't like I felt a supernatural, inability to be hurt or anything crazy like that. But I did feel a strange, unexperienced calm come over me, and a realization that while things were impossibly unlikely to survive, that it would be okay, that I would
Hmm.
get out if I just kept my head and just kept trying to process through it. It's what and this is, since I've written my third book, I've really started to research this more, and it's what I've come to learn is called a peak experience, which is I think termed by Maslow, Abraham Maslow, the psychoanalyst.
Hmm.
And what it is essentially, in my words at any rate, is the act of going with total purpose and confidence into a near impossible situation with exceptional abilities that are beyond your own understanding, and despite the unlikelihood of success, having a feeling deep in your soul that it's going to be okay, and to have that feeling once will want you will beg for you to go back and try and either experience again or try and figure out what it is. And I've had it happen in all three of my books,
Huh.
and not in the books, but in the stories the books relate.
Yeah.
And um, and in very very different circumstances. Uh, but that in a nutshell is the main uh, exciting aspect of my books, that I try to relate. The part that is physically dangerous and challenging, then beyond that, I think, particularly in my third book, The Lost Intruder, it becomes quite a bit more introspective and trying to understand why things have occurred and how they've occurred.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I've ever experienced anything like that. I don't think I have, but I'll get this, like, I mean, like, I've never been scuba diving or anything, but more just like snorkeling and different things like that, and like zip lining. And it's a thing where your adrenaline gets pumping and stuff like that, and I'll feel like, I'll feel my adrenaline go up and everything, and I just know that I have to do it. Um, and then what I more enjoy is almost the feeling afterwards of like the sense of accomplishment that I actually did it, and that it's over with, and that I did what I wanted to do and accomplished it, and now I can relax and I'm done and I'm safe. Do you have those kind of feelings afterwards, or?
That's part of what I felt, for certain.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, these peak experiences are apparently very common in athletes,
Uh-huh.
and professional athletes learn, I think, often to perform at that level at command, which is really amazing.
Yeah.
But it's not restricted to life-threatening circumstances by any means. And from what I've read, it can happen in all sorts of endeavors. But it's just you're acting on step, in the groove, with a heightened sense of awareness, and what Maslow also calls self-actualization. And that's beyond that, in my understanding of it, to a certain degree, but it encompasses it as one aspect. Peak experiences, that is.
Mm-hmm. So is like having a peak experience, is that something that you would kind of recommend or hope that everybody at least experiences once?
Well, I certainly do in the fields of if they can achieve that in athletics, or I know that I've felt it at times writing. When you find your voice and you're writing and things come effortlessly, and you look back the next day over that and you go, wow, that was pretty good. and and then the next day it's just a drudge, and it's hard and it's normal.
Right.
So I know that I've experienced it to a less dramatic degree in things like writing. I think it's wonderful. I think maybe a lot of people experience it without realizing it or without acknowledging it. But in order for me to really to catch my attention, it needed to be something physical and something with a certain element of risk and danger to it. And that's my shortcoming. Other people, I don't think, need to do that necessarily to feel it. But I don't think there's a recipe that I'm aware of to achieve it. I certainly haven't found it. I can't turn it on or off, but peak athletes would be the ones to ask about that, I suppose, because evidently there are some who can really, really turn it on and off at will.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because I guess when you were talking about it before, I just kind of thought of it and assumed that it was only kind of from a physical experience, but that makes sense, where I think we've all sort of experienced that, where we can, when we think about it, of, getting into that peak performance, spot where stuff just flows and feels good and it just happens.
Flows is the perfect word for it. And not to get too metaphysical, but I really do think it's flowing with where you're going to end up anyway. But it's just, you're not fighting it. You're not fighting going with it. In my first book, it came from a very different experience, but in many ways a lot more distinct and a lot more compact, because of the training I had undergone. Much like a peak athlete, different subject, but they train constantly and with very high technology. They train naval aviators the same way. And my first book, Angles of Attack, is about flying A-6 Intruder attack bombers from the USS Ranger during Operation Desert Storm. And I was fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough, depending how you look at it, with my bombardier navigator to launch on the Ranger's first strike, which was a low-level mission into a coastal naval facility off of Iraq, which meant covering about 7 miles of land, and it was highly defended, with multiple surface-to-air missile systems and just myriad anti-aircraft artillery emplacements, shooting basically guns up in the sky to such a degree that they were just hoping that it's called barrage fire. You just shoot up enough and they figure that there's no way anybody can get through it. And you're going to shoot yourself down because you're going to hit a piece of metal either going up or going down, and that's going to bring down the jet. Or it will distract the pilot enough that they abort before they go to the target. Because of the training, because of a number of reasons, that I would say it heightened experience even a lot more over than being lost in the Andrea Doria, which had occurred to me 8 years prior to that. And it was much more succinct, defined. And I was doing things, quite frankly, which I would have made my stomach turn, a week before, off target, flying 200 feet off the ground, making a 5G turn in the fog, at night.
Jeez.
But while you're getting shot at, and it's an absolute feeling of being on step, being ready, and at a heightened sense of awareness, and all the things that I described before. But that whole experience in total got me thinking as to there's something important going on here, and while I couldn't verbalize it or think about it in a cogent manner like I hope I'm projecting now, but I knew there was something important that needed to be conveyed, and so I told the story through the book Angles of Attack, and I now that I look back, it's crystal clear to me the commonalities between these 3 books and these three life experiences that have really defined who I am. The other place around the aircraft carrier, which I think pilots routinely experience this, is during night carrier landings, where the level of concentration and proficiency has to be at such a level every time you do it, whether you're feeling good, feeling bad, anything, that sooner or later you're gonna have that feeling that tonight it was effortless, it was easy, and then the next night you go back out and you're fighting everything every inch of the way, and you're scared shitless, frankly, So that's essentially what my first book, which was my second set of experiences with peak experience, is about.
Right. Okay. Whew, wow. So I guess just jumping back to your diving at the Andrea Doria, what was the reason or impetus to do that? Was it just to kind of explore it, or was there kind of a goal to doing that?
Well, yes, to explore it, but there's a certain urgency to it initially, and the reason is that when Peter Gimbel cut those forward-deck doors open and started to dig out all the debris to try and find the purser safe, he made a movie of it, and he aired it in 1982, I think, and it showed basically that there was China just laying out there, just hand painted, and it was basically a wreck diver's dream. I mean, artifacts at that time, it's a huge no these days to take artifacts off shipwrecks, but back then that was the reason you were doing it. It was all trophy. It was all trophy. And there was a little bit of financial value to it, monetary value, but not enough to risk your life. I mean, back then you could sell maybe a really nice rare piece of china for $200, and so that wasn't the reason you were doing it. But yes, that became commonly known in the wreck diving cadre circles And that's why people were going out there and started to charter boats actually to go out there, was to recover some of this china. And then that led on to all sorts of other things in different places to penetrate the wreck, and different goals. And these days, I suspect they're way out, well, the artifact hunters are probably outnumbered by the photographers and videographers,
Right.
but they're still out there.
Yeah. Yeah, man. That must just be amazing. That would be so amazing to see. I can't imagine. So the Stockholm that hit the Andrea Doria didn't sink, did it?
No, it had a nice reinforced bow because it was used to cruising in northern waters,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a Swedish liner. And there was 5 people killed in the initial collision again, but they were the only people. They were up by the bow anchor, and actually one of them was dragged to the bottom with the anchor. The anchor was inadvertently released, and he was
Oh
dragged
man.
to. They had to torch with an acetylene torch the chain off the anchor, and abandon it, because they anchored right near the collision, and the two were in danger of coming back into contact with each other, the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm.
Oh whoa.
But so it's, for the first several hours, actually the full 10 hours until the last person was off, and then 13 hours after that, not after that, 13 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria eventually sank.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of stories of, bravery, some of cowardice, some of alleged cowardice. But I would recommend. I think there's about every 10 years, 8 or 10 years, a new book is written about the topside, experience of the collision and that sort of thing. I'd still recommend the first one written, which was by Alvin Moscow in 1958 or something, just a couple of years after the
Uh-huh.
collision. And he was a New York Times reporter, and that's from my book. That's where most of my information comes from
Oh,
for the
okay.
topside information. And I gladly give him credit because he's written a phenomenal book.
Wow, okay, cool. Good to know. Yeah, I'm interested in that. Because it just
Yeah.
seems the sheer like coincidence of these two boats just running into each other in the ocean is just, I mean,
Well, what you have to understand, and I guess I did not explain this, was that the Nantucket Lightship is a point that pretty much every ship leaving, going to the east, and every ship coming into New York Harbor will transit within a couple miles of it. So it isn't a
oh,
big ocean right there.
I
Right there,
see.
it's a very crowded ocean. Now, there's set rules at the time which were voluntary, which would dictate which side you go on, speeds that you do, this type of thing. Since then, I think they've become more mandatory.
Yeah.
But if you're not a signatory to the pact, which I know the Stockholm wasn't, then you don't have to abide by them. In any case, they're routinely ignored even by the signatories, just because
Jeez.
time is money, and a captain is judged by his ability to keep a schedule. And if he wanted to keep command of his ship, then he better make his schedule. And that's an unfortunate reality, which I'd like to think we've outgrown completely. But from my experience of 10 years of flying in the airlines, sometimes we're not as advanced and as evolved as we'd like to think we are. And we all succumb to these pressures.
Yeah.
But hopefully in the airline industry, and I believe this is true, it's a lot more safe.
Mm-hmm. Whew, wow. Okay, so I guess so after you kind of moved back to New York and you were doing this diving and stuff, but then that's when you went into the military, right? After that?
Yes,
In
19.
1985. Okay. And then so I guess can you just tell me a bit about that? We kind of went into it a bit of what you did, but I mean, what was kind of your experience and all that stuff?
Well, I went through aviation officer candidate school. If anybody's who's seen the movie An Officer and a Gentleman, that's what that's based on. Although the real thing is quite a bit harder than the movie. The movie's
Oh.
but and essentially that meant that you get to pay for your own college and then enter the Navy without anybody helping you out. But
Oh, jeez.
you get to go in as an officer with the opportunity, no guarantees, but an opportunity to fly, depending on your grades and your physical ability, primarily your eyesight, how well that holds up. I was fortunate and lucked into basically having a good pair of eyes, and at the time, not anymore, but I did pretty well in flight school, and so I ended up flying A-6s after I got my wings in 1987, and that was up in Whidbey Island, Washington, which is where I'm living now. And then I ended up making 3 deployments, 2 on the Carrier Ranger and 1 on the Carrier Kitty Hawk, off of the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and off of Korea for the 1994 nuclear crisis. But, essentially, the defining thing about the A-6, as far as the Navy was concerned, was it was the only night, low-level, all-weather bomber. So we would routinely train up here, going 500 feet or so in the Olympic and Cascade mountain ranges over to the target in Boardman, Oregon, and drop practice bombs on on a target, and then come back, basically all on the instruments, doing it at night in the weather. And during the 1980s, there's an unbelievable amount, something like 27, 28 aircraft were lost just in training. And this is both coasts worldwide, but a good number of them, I'm guessing probably a third, were in the mountains up here, just training.
Wow.
We lost in Desert Storm the second night of the war from our sister squadron, another A-6 squadron on board Ranger. They lost an air crew going into the same target that Rivers Cleveland and I had gone into, and that was Kassar, and the crew of that was Tom Costin and Charlie Turner. And they also were doing a low altitude strike, but they were dropping mines at the approach of the waterway inbound, and they were shot down, probably by AAA, anti-aircraft artillery.
Right. Man.
But after that, after the first couple of days of Desert Storm, there was a large number of losses. There ended up being 5 A-6 losses just in the 6-week war. And Tornadoes had the same type of mission, though. It's a British attack bomber, and they lost, I think, even more, 6, 7, or 8. And there was a number of other U.S. Air Force ones that were lost as well, I believe, that had that mission. But that was the A-6 was the only Navy aircraft that had the night, low level, day, night, and all weather capability. But after the first week or so of Desert Storm, they bought everybody high, said, this is crazy, we're losing way too many aircraft and crew, and they never went back down. They lost the mission, and the A-6s were eventually decommissioned, largely because of that, in my opinion. And then I ended up getting out of the Navy after 10 years of service.
Wow. Right. Man, crazy. And it's how you kind of relate them, the experience of flying for the Navy with, your diving. You feel like there's similar kind of peak experiences, correct?
Yeah, I did not, at the time, I wouldn't have recognized that, and I didn't.
Yeah.
But in the book itself, the Angles of Attack, I do make the reference to diving the Andrea and getting lost in the first class dining room. So I knew there was a commonality there, and I termed it as it had been the only time I had been that scared before, as on the first strike. But there was more to it. I just couldn't verbalize it then.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and essentially the book itself is about that, and then in addition to that, there's some other side stories, most of which revolves around just giving. They're all nonfiction, of course, about the everyday life on the carrier of everybody. The enlisted men who do all the hard grunt work, and the officers who live a pretty pampered life in comparison, and essentially with a little element of personal. I mean, here's an aside. in life's oddities. My uncle at the time happened to be the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Thomas Pickering. And he was the ambassador then at the same time that I was flying on the first strike. And my parents had been living in Syria, and they were not evacuated until a couple of days after that. So the first night of the war, we were all intimately involved in this situation in extremely different ways. Couldn't have been, but I have always thought that's kind of an odd and interesting, meaningful in some way, but I have no idea how.
Yeah, really. Crazy stuff. Wow, okay. So then after that, you got out of the Navy and the military, and then that's when you started flying commercially, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
For 10 years, I flew for United Airlines, and it was, great. It was relatively easy. No peak experiences there, which is good.
That's good. Yeah.
You want everything to be a peak experience. Excitement is not good, and that's the way we want it. But at any rate, one day I walked into flight operations early one morning, and I looked down, my hands just shaking like this. So I did the manly thing and stuck it in my pocket and kept going, and tried to figure it out on my own for about a month, and finally said, okay, I got to go to a neurologist and get this checked out. And went to a doctor friend, and then went to a neurologist, and yeah, I had Parkinson's, and that was immediately ended my flight career, and I didn't know what to make of it at first, or second, or third, and I'm still figuring it out as time goes on. But it's been 14 years, and that's been quite a travel. In 19, not 19, so I was diagnosed in 2005. In 1989, this is where they all come together, all the books and all the stories. A Navy A-6 out of Whidbey Island, up near where I live, from my squadron, had gone flying to go on a training mission, and climbing through 12,000 feet. They had a hydraulic failure. They came back to make a precautionary emergency approach, lost their other two hydraulic systems, and ended up crashing in the water, just somewhere, probably only, at the time we thought it was probably only 7 miles at the max offshore. Both crew ejected safely, were picked up in the water by the search and rescue helicopter.
Oh, okay.
Now, I had flown that plane, that specific plane, both in the aircraft carrier Ranger and ashore. The Navy spent 2 months and 4 ships looking for it. They could never find it because they wanted to determine with finality what caused the accident.
Mm-hmm.
So I had in the back of my mind, hey, I'm a diver. I've flown this plane. Someday I'm going to go look for this and I'm going to find it.
Right.
But I put it off for year after year after year, decades. And in 2014, my Parkinson's symptoms had gotten to the point where I realized if I don't start looking now, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to do it. I can barely dive as it is. I had deep brain stimulation surgery scheduled for November of 2014. And so I started looking. When all I had a boat, 32-foot boat. I had dive gear. My friends bought me a nice, high-quality recreational depth sounder, and that was it. And I went out into a confluence of synchronistic events, of meaningful coincidences, in my opinion. I ended up meeting up with a gent who had a side scan sonar, a number of technical divers who were still very interested, one of whom, by the way, had actually been in the same squadron as me a year before and had worked on that plane.
Oh, wow.
And he ended up being one of the first 3 divers to find it when we did find it.
Oh, crazy.
So, interesting. Anyway, so we ended up looking. It took a year and a half, during which time I underwent brain surgery, which is why I'm able to speak to you now with probably looks relatively symptom-free. They've got batteries in my chest and wires going up. That's a wire. I don't know if you can see that. Probably not. Goes up to my brain. I've got 2 wires go up to my brain and give signals, which I don't know how, but it does disrupt the erroneous signals sent by my brain to my muscles to a certain degree. It's mitigated a lot of symptoms, but they are getting worse, and they will continue to get worse because it only lasts so long. at any rate, that's what the third book is about. And while there's no, you guys start getting my dog going in a second here. She's laying on the couch, not too
Yes.
long. At any rate, uh, where was I? So there's no specific peak experience per se in this experience, but overall, the entire thing, I had never a doubt in my mind that we were going to find this.
Uh-huh.
And the entire experience was a self-actualization, in my opinion, of which it was on a grander scale than that. I mean, I was under a lot of discomfort, just plain old pain, and I made a lot of errors. I was never on step, but I knew that I was going to find it. And it has no value. I mean, there's no historic value, no monetary value. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was the perfect goal for me to try and set out to achieve during this period before my surgery and afterwards. And it got me through a very, very difficult time and got me thinking, because during that entire discomfort prior to surgery, I was happy.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a lot of pain, constant pain. I was sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night, and that was disrupted. I mean, this is for months. Now it's been years, and I still do that. But I was happy then, and I couldn't understand it. And then I had my brain surgery, and I knew in my gut, when I have that and I lose these symptoms, I'm going to lose that sense of well-being. I mean, it wasn't a giddy happiness; it was a peaceful.
Right.
You know, I knew it was okay. And sure enough, I did. And then I spent the last couple of years after that, now it's been over 4 years, trying to figure out what this, how to recreate that happiness without having to do this sort of experience that I do in our everyday life. And I've been doing a lot of reading. I spent a lot of number of years deeply depressed, drinking way too much. Bad stuff, but I've come to learn that except for the drinking part, the depression that we so often are so quick to dispel is what ancient Greeks, called melancholy. And it's essentially, it serves a purpose. And I look back now and I say, without years of reflection and isolation and meditation, I would not have come to any of the conclusions that I have, as sketchy as they are and as tenuous as they are. They're still what keep me smiling every day, and really have made the entire ride worthwhile.
Wow. Boom. That was good. I think that was a good conclusion to this, Peter. That was awesome. I love that.
Good. All right. Well, then I guess that's it.
Yeah, no, that was great. I really appreciate you sharing all that and stuff. And I'm only 25, so I feel like I can't totally, relate to everything that you have to say, but I really love, your stories and everything that you have to share and how you're able to learn all that and stuff. I'm really excited to get in and read your books now. Hello, you there? Oh,
Sorry,
no
Rob.
worries. No worries.
Sorry. And I just had to decline it.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. This is a fortunate thing that we were done.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, again, I appreciate you sharing everything. So for people listening, where can we find your books? Where can we find you? Where should they go?
You can find the books at Amazon. It's Angles of Attack and A-6 Intruder Pilot Tour, Setting the Hook, A Diver's Return to the Andrea Doria, and The Lost Intruder, the Search for a Navy Jet, the Lost Navy Jet, Missing Navy Jet. They're available on Amazon, any bookstore on request, but generally they're not stocked in bookstores. And you can also go to my website for more information or to buy them, and that's at peterhuntbooks.com.
Cool, perfect. I'll throw in the. Go ahead. What?
And I've got Facebook pages for each book as well, which are easy enough to find.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, I'll throw in the links for all that stuff in the bottom of the show notes so people can click on that and check them out. So